At the beginning of this series, I brought up Gamergate and Anita Sarkeesian. This is because I don't feel like I could talk about the issues of male dominance in gaming culture without recognizing the overt, abrasively stated acts of male dominance that occurred during the Gamergate controversy and in the events leading up to it. Whole videos could be made on how the toxic culture of Gamergate spawned an entire political shift in young men and boys who participated in gaming culture, and in fact there have been. I have my own video on something tangentially related entitled YouTube Skepticism and the Identity Politics of Toxic Masculinity, which touches on the intersections between nerd culture and the new atheist movement. But I also highly recommend Shaun's video, The Fate of the Frogmen, which goes into the shift from Gamergater to alt-righter and what sort of spawned it. I do not think that everyone who is a participant in gaming culture is going to be an alt-righter, nor do I think that everyone who had any affiliations with Gamergate will be an alt-righter either, but it's impossible to ignore the wider implications of Gamergate when discussing male dominance in the culture. In The Fate of the Frogmen, Shaun talks about how Gamergaters constructed an us versus them mentality in relation to feminists, who they perceive as attacking their core identity as gamers. This is interesting because earlier in my video I discussed how there is a distinction made between hardcore gamers and casuals, and this is an implicitly gendered form of terminology. The us versus them mentality stems from cultural anxieties that men experience mixed with the othering of people who aren't like them, such as what I described previously with the othering of women from men by portraying them in non-empathetic, male-centric ways. Games do not create misogynists or sexists, but they do reflect a wider culture. The state of otherness given to marginalized people is not created by games, but it is perpetuated by it. And games are one of many avenues through which gamers learn to essentialize the difference between men and women, and then devalue women as a result. Given that games devalue women through portraying feminine perspectives as less important or supplementary rather than crucial, it's not surprising that gamers tend to view women on similarly devalued terms. This is an industry problem in that the games themselves are not responsible for the issues of sexism, rather than the developers who bring sexist ideology into the games through their already held beliefs that men matter more as characters and as a potential audience. Now we're going to have some fun. We're going to read about violence and terrorism. First, I'm going to restate a quote from part 2, from Gender and Power. When social life embodies these kinds of contradictions, the categories of people in power, aristocrats, the rich, men, spend a great deal of energy maintaining their power. They protect their material resources, subdue the disenfranchised with public or private violence, coercion, and repression, and try to control public and private expressions of ideologies, of political and religious power. This quote illustrates that when subordinate groups, such as women, try to make a push towards equality and against the power of the privileged will go to any length, including violence and coercion, to try to force things to stay the way they are. Here's another quote, again from Generic Processes and the Reproduction of Inequality. Violence can also function ideologically to maintain boundaries. When the capacity to enact violence is valorized within a culture, it becomes a criterion by which to decide who qualifies for membership in dominant or elite groups. Violence is used to maintain who is and is not allowed to have power within a particular society and culture. This is reflected in the extreme lengths that Gamergate went to in order to prevent feminist influences from affecting gaming culture. Men who wanted to maintain gaming as they preferred it, which is to say, as a culture which privileges them at the expense of women, tried to effectively bully women who were advocating for a change into silence through waves of harassment. This happened to Anita Sarkeesian, Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, and a whole host of other games critics and developers. The results were extreme, but they weren't entirely unprecedented. People just didn't expect such intense, organized harassment to come from gaming culture specifically. Now let's take a small detour towards another group whose behaviors and ideology mirror that of Gamergate. Let's talk about white supremacists. In Michael Kimmel's article, Gender, Class, and Terrorism, featured in the book Men's Lives, which again, thanks to my professor for lending me it, Kimmel describes the sociological underpinnings of white supremacist ideology. What they want, says one member, is to take back what is rightfully ours. Their anger often fixes on others, women, members of minority groups, immigrants, gay men, and lesbians, in part because those are the people with whom they compete for entry-level minimum wage managed jobs. Above them all, enjoying the view, hovers the international Jewish conspiracy. What holds together these paranoid politics, anti-government, anti-global capital but pro-small capitalist, racist, sexist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, is a rhetoric of masculinity. These men feel emasculated by big money and big government. They call the government the nanny state, and they claim that others have been handed the birthright of native-born white men. In the eyes of such downwardly mobile white men, most white American males collude in their own emasculation. They've grown soft, feminized, weak. White supremacist websites abound with complaints about the whimpering collapse of the blonde male. The legions of sissies and weaklings, of flabby, limp-wristed, non-aggressive, non-physical, indecisive, slack-jawed, fearful males who, while still heterosexual in theory and practice, have not even a vestige of the old macho spirit. American white supremacists thus offer American men the restoration of their masculinity, a manhood in which individual white men control the fruits of their own labor and are not subject to emasculation by Jewish-owned finance capital or a black and feminist-controlled welfare state. This is the militarized manhood of the heroic John Rambo, a manhood that celebrates their God-sanctioned right to band together and arm militias if anyone or any government agency tries to take it away from them. If the state and the economy emasculate them, and if the masculinity of the others is problematic, then only real white men can rescue America from a feminized, multicultural, androgynous melting pot. Shaun covered the ties between the alt-right and Gamergate in his video The Fate of the Frogmen, so it's not a coincidence that Gamergate rhetoric mirrors white supremacists. Simply put, a lot of gamers are white supremacists. I'm not saying all are, or even a majority. What I am saying is that a vocal minority of privileged white men harassing women, queer people, trans people, and people of color in a way that mirrors acts of terrorism precisely because this vocal minority seems to believe the same thing as white supremacist terrorists, such as Timothy McVeigh, the main terrorist mentioned in Kimmel's article. So they seem to have a hostile fear towards the idea of their culture becoming feminized in any way, and so they lash out at anyone who presents this possibility, even if that's just a misconception. If you want to know why moments like Gamergate happen, it's because the social norms of devaluing feminine perspectives and creating a sense of otherness and inferiority to women, mixed with men's ever-building anxiety towards the world's expectations of them to perform hegemonic masculinity, a performance which I'd like to point out is quite literally impossible, leads to a lashing out at the perfect intersection between the two phenomena: feminists. Feminist women, especially women like Nita, who are feminist critics first, thus not quote-unquote true gamers, make up the perfect mixture of seemingly attacking men for the moral ramifications of toxic masculine ideals that they strive for and hold deeply felt anxiety about, and the supposed inferiority of women in our perspectives. Feminism is viewed as an affront to the social order and a personal attack on the anxieties that unknowingly stem from the very same social order that the men hold as ideal. They look back to earlier days when gaming meant something that was important and personal to them, and then they look at feminist critiques and ask, why can't things go back to how they used to be? The answer to that question is because how things used to be was terrible. I quit online gaming pretty shortly before Nita started getting harassment for her Kickstarter campaign. But I had been playing for half a decade at that point on the regular. And before that, I had occasionally stepped into online games from back as early as 1999. Most of my memories of gaming were harassment I had experienced, and while my respondents mostly said they hadn't, over 1/4 of them said they had experienced some form of harassment based on gender, sexuality, or race. Most people who responded saying they hadn't had some sort of qualifier about why they hadn't. It's been a relatively unspoken norm of gaming that if you participate in gaming culture, you will be harassed. This has been true for well over a decade. The only reason why this is even viewed as unproblematic is because a lot of men are taught that they need to just stomach it and pretend that it doesn't affect them. And while it might not affect a lot of men, the long-term effects of being treated like garbage can't be good. Meanwhile, people of color, women, trans and non-binary people, queer people, the effect will be significantly worse. The reason why I pointed to Anita's harassment in 2012 is because these things are not isolated incidents. There's a trend. The trend is that measures towards dealing with the kinds of issues in gaming that Anita brings up is met with hostility from gamers. They often interpret critiques of anything related to gaming as personal attacks because gamer is itself a sort of identity politic, to which I point back to Noah Gervais' video on the subject as a reference point. Why harassers do what they do leans into a much bigger discussion that has been going on in sociology and psychology for quite a while about why people, mostly men, feel entitled to intimidate, threaten, and commit acts of violence against anyone who they feel threatened by. It's honestly a bit of a tired discussion, but Gamergate specifically interests me because of a lot of the mechanisms involved. I mentioned in my YouTube Skeptic video that there is an emphasis on winning arguments rather than learning from them. Domination is the name of the game, and domination is given a sort of ritual, a sport-like attempt at masculinity through intellect. The same is true, though, in a different form with a lot of the issues of Gamergate. Domination became a ritual, but the ritual is not so much sport-like as almost a form of terrorism. There was still an element of conquest, but instead of winning arguments, the end goal were things like trying to bully Zoe Quinn into suicide, and seemingly trying to get Anita Sarkeesian to quit feminist media criticism altogether. In the other parts of this video, I discussed the more passive means of male dominance reinstating itself through the behaviors and beliefs of gaming culture. Harassment, on the other hand, is an active attempt to do the very same. The problem is, there is a sort of gamified element to the process. Gamergate was not just a hate mob, they were more of a hate team, portraying feminists and marginalized people as a literal us versus them game in which the objective was to win back gaming culture for cis-het white men. This portrayal of an objective, of a collective strategy, of planning and adapting to plans to changes to the name of the game, serves as, I think, a damning reflection of why a lot of men play games, to dominate. Not all men do this, of course, but those who harass do. Those who harass also don't take it as very serious that they wish to dominate. To them, it's all part of the game. Even though when they regularly drop slurs and dehumanize women and people of color and LGBTQ people, it becomes very fucking real for most of us. What happens is, surrounded by entertainment and all sorts of mediums that affirm the value of cis-het white men at the expense of everyone else, it becomes just games when actual moves of acting out systemic oppression occur. So it's seen as a non-issue because it never has to become an issue for them. When it finally does, they use the behavioral language of gaming as the template for how to respond. They don fake identities and under the cover of anonymity, they attack until they achieve what they perceive to be some form of victory. The goal for them is to win. The goal for the rest of us is to just survive, and not in a video game sense, in a real sense. The real-world consequences of the harassment aren't seen as that important to them because they've already experienced such a state of otherness towards marginalized people that we might as well be NPCs to them. Depression Quest, the game made by Zoe Quinn that got attention within gaming spheres, which eventually spiraled out of control once Gamergate started, is a game that serves as an antithesis to this exact mentality. Depression Quest isn't a game about winning or losing. It's a game about learning, coping, managing, and growing. These are very real things, and Zoe tried to make them feel real to the typical audience of gaming. Even though the main character isn't gendered explicitly, the implicit narrative of the game is that the main character is a straight man. The idea of being able to generate empathy for experiences with depression was rejected in droves for the toxic subset of gaming fans who would go on to terrorize Zoe in the Gamergate controversy. It's a shame too, because it's a very valuable effort, and that effort was recognized by game critics and fans who are not that subset of gaming fans. It's that subset of gaming fans that allow the maintenance of the male-dominated space of gaming by rejecting games, game developers, game fans, and game critics who pose any threat to the absolute domination of toxic masculinity on the culture at large. It's not just a rejection through criticism. It's an outright effort to have these things removed and to even have the possibility of exploring non-hegemonic perspectives rendered impossible. Absolute male dominance is impossible, but the day-to-day harassment, especially towards marginalized people, that happens in gaming spaces helps pave way for the big waves of harassment that we saw with Gamergate by normalizing the idea that harassing someone is an acceptable thing to do when they pose any sort of perceived threat. Not everyone plays video games to be winners, but the popularity of competitive gaming constructs winning as an ideal, and when this mixes with prior, deeply ingrained notions of masculine dominance, it causes already domination-obsessed men to perceive the ever-growing feminist influence on gaming culture to be the opposing side of what they might call a cultural war, though a more accurate term would be a cultural team deathmatch. To stop day-to-day harassment within the culture, we need to take measures towards increasing the penalties for engaging in harassing and abusive behaviors. To stop the big moments like Gamergate from happening will be a lot more complicated, because that plays into bigger systemic issues, but a good starting point is to decrease the influence of male dominance on gaming culture and its participants.